The night air was thick with tension as Marcus stepped out of his car, his heart still racing from the flashing red and blue lights behind him. He had done nothing wrong, just a routine drive home after visiting his mother, but experience told him that didn't matter. The officer, a burly man with a cold stare, walked up, eyes immediately landing on the gold ring glinting on Marcus's finger. "That yours?" the cop asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. The ring wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It belonged to his late father, a symbol of his family's legacy. But before Marcus could explain, the officer grabbed his wrist, yanking the ring off without warning. "Looks stolen," the cop muttered, slipping it into his pocket. Marcus felt his chest tighten with anger and disbelief. He wanted to fight back, to demand justice, but he knew how these situations could go. Just as his pulse pounded in his ears, another set of headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and out stepped a man in uniform, his father's best friend, now the city's chief of police. And he wasn't here to play games. The chief of police stepped out of his SUV, his presence commanding instant attention. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the streetlights, but it was his expression, calm yet firm, that sent a wave of unease through the officer gripping Marcus's wrist. "What's going on here?" the chief asked, his voice steady but heavy with authority. Marcus exhaled sharply, still in shock. He had known the chief since childhood, had sat at his dinner table as a kid, listening to stories about his father. But right now, none of that mattered, because the cop in front of him, the one who had stolen his ring, was frozen in place, suddenly aware of who he had just messed with. The officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Routine stop," he muttered. "Just checking things out." The chief's gaze dropped to Marcus's empty finger, then flicked to the officer's pocket. Silence stretched between them. "Give it back," the chief finally said, his voice low. The officer hesitated. His fingers twitched, his jaw tightened. He knew he was caught, but giving up the ring meant admitting what he had done. And that was a problem he wasn't ready to face. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the officer's hesitation. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unspoken. The chief took a step closer, his eyes locked onto the man in uniform. "I said, give it back," the chief repeated, his tone still even but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. The officer shifted, his hand hovering over his pocket. His mind was racing. He could feel the chief's authority pressing down on him, but he also knew what this meant. If he handed over the ring, he was admitting guilt. And if word got out, his career, his reputation, everything could be on the line. Marcus clenched his fists. This wasn't just about the ring anymore. It was about all the times he had been stopped for no reason, all the moments he had swallowed his pride to avoid trouble. But now, standing here with someone who actually had power, the balance of control had shifted. Still, the officer refused to move. Instead, he glanced around, as if searching for an escape. A few cars passed in the distance, their headlights flashing briefly over the tense standoff. Then, with a tight-lipped smirk, he shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus's stomach dropped. He knew that look. It was the same look he had seen too many times before, the kind that said, asterisk, "You're just another guy with no proof, and I'm the one with the badge asterisk." But what the officer hadn't realized yet was that this time, he wasn't in control of the story. The chief's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. His eyes stayed on the officer, unblinking, reading every flicker of hesitation in his expression. Marcus could feel the shift. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a test of power, of truth, of who would stand their ground. You don't know what I'm talking about, the chief repeated, his voice quieter now, but somehow even more dangerous. The officer squared his shoulders, his fingers curling slightly. He had a choice. Admit the truth or double down. He chose the latter. I stopped him for a reason, he said, his voice firm but uneasy. He looked suspicious. Marcus felt something hot rise in his chest. Asterisk suspicious. Asterisk he had heard that excuse his whole life. He had been suspicious while walking down the street, suspicious while shopping, suspicious for simply existing. But this time he wasn't alone. The chief took another step forward, his presence now impossible to ignore. Let's get something straight, he said, his voice dangerously calm. That man is wearing his father's ring. I've known his family longer than you've worn that badge. So I'll ask you one last time. Give it back. The officer swallowed hard. His grip tightened around the ring still hidden in his pocket. He could feel the weight of his mistake, the heat of being caught. But his pride, his fear of losing control, wouldn't let him back down. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then in the distance, the faint sound of another siren cut through the air, growing louder. Another patrol car was approaching. More eyes, more accountability. And suddenly, the officer realized he was out of time. The wail of the siren grew louder, the flashing lights bouncing off the pavement as another patrol car pulled up. Marcus barely breathed, his pulse hammering in his ears. The officer's face paled for a split second before he masked it with a scowl. He wasn't just caught, he was cornered. The car door swung open, and another officer stepped out, his eyes flicking between the tense scene before him. He was younger, his uniform crisp, his stance hesitant like he had walked into something bigger than he had expected. "Everything okay here, Chief?" the new officer asked cautiously. The chief didn't move his gaze from the man in front of him. "That depends," he said, his voice like steel. "Your partner here has something that doesn't belong to him." Marcus watched as the new officer's brow furrowed in confusion. His eyes darted to his colleague, whose fingers were now gripping his pocket like it held more than just a stolen ring. It held the last shred of control he had left. The chief took another step forward, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Empty your pocket." The officer's nostrils flared. He knew he couldn't win, but he also knew giving up now meant more than just handing over the ring. It meant exposure, consequences. His mind raced for a way out. Then, just as the silence stretched too far, he made his move. In one swift motion, he pulled out the ring and tossed it, hard, into the darkness. Marcus gasped. His heart dropped as the gold band disappeared into the night, landing somewhere out of sight. The chief's eyes flashed with fury, but before anyone could react, the officer turned sharply to his partner. "You saw it," he said quickly, his voice desperate, shifting the blame before it could fully land on him. "I was just following procedure. The suspect was acting aggressive. I had to make a call." Marcus felt his hands shake. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even now, even after getting caught, the officer was twisting the truth, rewriting the story before his very eyes. The new officer hesitated. He glanced at Marcus, then back at the chief. This was the moment. Would he back up his partner, or would he tell the truth? But before he could speak, another voice cut through the night. "I saw everything." All heads turned. Standing just a few feet away, an older woman with sharp eyes and a phone in her hand stepped forward from the shadows. And by the look on her face, she had caught it all. The street fell silent. All eyes locked onto the woman, her phone still raised like a weapon. The glow from the screen illuminated her face, her expression sharp and unwavering. "I saw everything," she repeated, stepping closer. "And so did my camera." Marcus felt a flicker of hope cut through his anger. The officer's smirk vanished, his body tensing as if he'd just realized the walls were closing in. The chief, still calm but seething beneath the surface, turned back to him. "You threw away the ring," the chief said, his voice dangerously low. "And now you're lying about it." The younger officer shifted nervously, glancing between his partner and the woman. He looked unsure now, torn between loyalty and the truth. "Ma'am," he started cautiously, "are you saying you recorded this incident?" The woman let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Not just this. I started recording the moment he pulled this young man over." She looked at Marcus with a knowing glance. Something told me he might need someone to see the truth. The officer clenched his jaw, his mind scrambling for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not this time. The chief exhaled, shaking his head. "Enough of this," he said. "Hand over your badge." The officer stiffened. "You can't be serious." "I am serious," the chief interrupted. "You stole evidence, you lied, and now you've been caught. You're done." The moment stretched, thick with finality. The officer's fingers twitched, his entire career flashing before his eyes. But there was no way out. Reluctantly, he reached up, unclipped his badge, and dropped it into the chief's waiting hand. Marcus exhaled, the weight on his chest finally lifting. But just as relief settled in, the woman's voice cut through again. "That ring," she said suddenly, glancing toward the shadows where it had been thrown. "It's still out there." Marcus's breath caught. The conflict may have been over, but the most important thing, the one piece of his father he had left, was still missing. Without a second thought, he turned and sprinted into the darkness, his heart pounding. The others followed, their flashlights cutting through the night, scanning the pavement, the grass, the gutter. Then, after what felt like forever, Marcus saw it. A glint of gold nestled in the dirt. His chest tightened as he reached down, brushing off the dust. He turned back to the chief, the woman, and the stunned younger officer, holding up the ring. The chief gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just faced. Marcus slid the ring back onto his finger, gripping it tightly. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had one asterisk. Marcus stood there for a moment, staring at the ring on his finger, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. It wasn't just about the gold band. It was about his father, his family, his right to be treated with dignity. He had almost lost it, but now, against all odds, it was back where it belonged. The chief turned to the younger officer, who still looked shaken. "Remember this night," he said firmly. "Remember that your badge is meant to protect, not to be used as a weapon against the people you serve." The young officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Maybe this was a lesson he would carry forward. Maybe not. But at least tonight, he had seen the difference between power and justice. Marcus looked at the woman who had stepped forward when he needed it most. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. She smiled knowingly. Sometimes the truth just needs a witness. As the night settled back into silence, Marcus took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he had faced injustice. It probably wouldn't be the last. But tonight, for once, the truth had been seen. And that was something worth holding on to.